Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
The Bureau of Economic Analysis is part of the Department of Commerce, and it's developing statistics measuring the contributions of space-related industries to the overall U.S. economy. These estimates give business leaders, policymakers, and the public a new tool to analyze the space economy and to inform investment decisions. The lead person developing those estimates is with us today. On this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast, we welcome back Dr. Tina Highfill, a research economist with the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And Tina, it is always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate you having me back.
Let's talk about, first of all, some of the major findings from the updated space economy statistics for 2017 through 2022. How have we changed as an industry?
Well, one of the major takeaways is that growth in 2022 in real GDP for the space economy was 2.3%, which was actually faster than the overall U.S. economy's growth. And that's the only time that's happened in the time series we have from 2017 to 2022. And so what we see is that for the first time, this fast growth is being caused by an increase in spending from national defense, so U.S. Space Force, but also private R&D. So it's really, Space Force is mostly R&D at this point. So a lot of R&D, both in the private and government sector, is driving growth in the space economy.
But that is kind of a lagging indicator, isn't it? Because we're going to have to wait and see what 2023 does when the economy in most sectors took a pretty significant downturn.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. So one of the downsides of the space economy statistics, one of the few downsides, is that it is lagged by a couple years. So the way that we produce these statistics is we first start with the overall U.S. economy, and then we drill down to just the space economy to see what contribution there is from space. And that takes a little bit of time because we need external data sources to do that. Government spending is a large part of the space economy, and it takes time to get those budget documents in. So you're right, it is retrospective, but it's still useful, I think, to understand, what's happened in relatively recent years.
So then what were some of the key revisions made to the previous estimates, and what prompted those changes?
Mm-hmm. So every 5 years at BEA, we do a comprehensive update, and this is for our official statistics, not just the space economy. So what that means is every 5 years, we introduce new data sources, methodological changes, and things like that. And so this year, we had a comprehensive update to the U.S. statistics, and so the space economy statistics were revised to go along with that. And the biggest revisions came from census data, U.S. Census Bureau, and they're the ones that collect data from businesses. And so we had more detailed data on manufacturing and wholesale trade, which are two of the largest industries in the space economy. And two things happened. So wholesale trade, it looked like we were underestimating that value in previous statistics. So we did see a few $1 billion increase for all 6 years from 2017 to 2022. And in manufacturing, we saw revisions down. So these kind of offsets. So we saw manufacturing, specifically with regard to GPS and PNT equipment, a revision down by a couple billion, and then a wholesale trade revision up. So in total, it kind of evened out. But the idea there is that we had more detailed data, and so we were able to get those revisions in this last release.
It seems like you looked at things in a couple of different ways. So I want to get from you how the growth of the space economy differs when you're using a narrow definition compared with a broad definition.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So when we were first developing the account, one of the biggest challenges is determining the definition and the scope of what is the space economy. And so we looked to previous research, we contacted subject matter experts and things like that. And what we determined is that there's a large group of data users that are interested in the space economy minus satellite television and satellite radio. Mm-hmm. I guess the idea there is that this is kind of a downstream use in some people's point of view of space. And also it's contracting. So, satellite television over the past few years has really declined a lot. And because it's a big part of the space economy, it's really dragged down growth. And so it was kind of hiding what was going on in other sectors. So what we did is we have our overall space economy statistics, which I just referred to, the growth rate of 2.3% in real GDP. But then we also have a line item that excludes satellite TV and satellite radio. And what that shows is when we remove those things, we see that growth is much faster across the board. So this really is a way for us to give our data users, kind of a choice between the more narrow version where satellites, TV and radio is removed versus the broader space economy that includes those things.
We talked about satellite TV and satellite radio when we talked last year. And it seems to me that with the advent of far more internet being supplied from space through Starlink and a couple of other services that are going to be coming online, do you think that's going to maybe change how those statistics are looked at, because that's still a space service? It's coming from space, and yet it's back to streaming television and streaming radio.
hmm Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, when I talk to people about what's going to happen in the future and what's going on with space now in terms of internet, that always comes up as the biggest, prediction for growth in the area. And so, the way we produce our statistics is by industry. So, the information industry is where satellite TV, broadcasting, satellite internet is located. And you can see in the overall industry that the growth has declined, but it's also evened out a little bit in the past couple of years. And so that's reflecting both kind of a leveling out of the satellite TV contraction. So it's not contracting as fast, but also an increase in usage of satellite internet. But as you mentioned before, we only have data through 2022,
Right.
and so I think that people could make an educated guess that the information sector is probably not declining anymore. It's probably either leveling out or increasing because of these new services that have just started to come online.
And in fact, all of the market forecast reports that I get, it all seems to indicate that a lot of that is going to be on the increase through over the next 10 years. It just seems like that's going to be one of the major growth industries. So it will be interesting to watch how that changes these statistics as the years go forward.
I agree. It'll be interesting, and also I'm personally interested to see when the inflection point will be, because we've been seeing this decline in information. It's starting to level off, but when is it really going to increase? Because satellite internet um, there's more potential for growth in outside of the United States than in the
Mhm.
United States. And so the statistics that we produce are for the US economy. So it's possible that, this growth that is being forecasted may not impact the US as much as other countries that have to, don't have other options outside of satellite internet.
How significant is the space economy's contribution to the overall U.S. GDP, and what trends are standing out to you?
Mhm. So in 2022, the space economy contributed half a percentage point to US GDP. So it was about $132 billion. And half a percent doesn't sound like a lot, of course, but when you think about the US economy, it's huge. Other sectors that compare to the space economy are the agricultural sector, which is also less than 1% of the total US economy. So when I say half a percent, most people, aren't really impressed, but it is actually a significant number. And in terms of trends for contributions to growth, what we've seen over the period 2017 to 2022 is that manufacturing has become the largest industry in the space economy, overtaking information. So we already talked about satellite TV, which is making the information sector shrink. But within manufacturing, we're seeing growth in both um, transportation equipment, so that space vehicles and space weapon systems are the two main things there. And then also electronic products. So this is the PNT equipment, satellites, and things like that. So we've seen a shift in the 6 years where we have data away from growth in information towards growth in manufacturing.
I think it's important to note that when people think about the space economy, they might not think about that aspect of it. I mean, when you talk about the number of laborers and workers that are required to do that manufacturing, to build the spaceports that are being built out, to do all of those things, and all of that factors into that growth.
Yeah, that's right. There's, I talk about these kind of big sectors, manufacturing and information, but within our data tables, you can see over almost 100 line items of industry data where there's growth just related to space products. So, as you mentioned, construction, that's growing because of the spaceports. Professional and business services, that's an industry that includes astronautical engineering, R&D. Thinking about retail trade, there's an increase in, the GPS PNT equipment is in so many of the things that we use now that, didn't show up before. And so it really is, you see space economy production across, almost every sector in the U.S. economy.
We talked a little bit earlier about economic trends as far as the actual overall economy is concerned. But I want to find out from you how inflation, because we've had inflation for about the past at least 2 years, impacted the growth of the space economy, particularly in 21 and 22.
Yeah, so just like the overall economy, inflation hit the space economy pretty hard in certain sectors. So wholesale trade is the most obvious uh, sector that was impacted. So wholesale trade, just to clarify, when wholesale trade is distribution. So when you're thinking about, let's say, a cell phone manufacturer in the United States wants to include a GPS transmitter in their cell phone. They typically will go to a distributor or wholesaler to buy that, as opposed to going straight to a manufacturer. So wholesalers are a big part of the space economy because, as I mentioned, we have all this PNT GPS equipment in a lot of the products that we own. And so wholesalers, their job is to move product, and their output is essentially the markup that they produce. So they typically will import GPS PNT equipment from overseas. They'll have it in their warehouse, and then they'll sell it to other businesses. And that markup that they get to sell that equipment is their output. And so what we saw in 2021 and 2022 is that wholesale prices increased a lot. I want to say, definitely double-digit growth. And what I heard anecdotally from people in the field is that this is supply chain issues. So, there was, because of COVID, most likely,
Right.
it was harder to get the GPS PNT equipment, and so these distributors had less supply and were able to charge more prices, charge higher prices, and so we saw, especially in wholesale trade, a really large increase in prices, which drags down growth. So if you compare our growth of our market prices GDP, we call that nominal GDP, versus GDP that removes inflation, there's a big discrepancy because a lot of growth in the market prices is just inflation. But I will note that wholesale trade was a big impact in terms of
Right.
inflation, but the actual equipment, the actual GPS PNT equipment within manufacturing, we've actually seen price declines over the period. So the equipment's actually getting cheaper, even though the distributors are charging more to when they sell it. So there's it's not just a bad story in terms of inflation.
How would you describe the trends that are apparent in private sector employment and compensation in the space economy?
Well, over the period, we've seen employment actually shrinking. So in 2022, there was about 340,000 private sector jobs related to the space economy. And this is a decline by a couple thousand over the period. And this is related to the information sector, so satellite television, as we mentioned, but also manufacturing. And we think that we have macroeconomic statistics, so we don't really know what's going on at the company level, but I do
Right.
talk to people in the field and things like that. And, my understanding is that as productivity increases in the manufacturing industry, so it's becoming cheaper to make things, there's new innovations like 3D printing, miniaturization, and things like that, where that industry is getting more productive, you often don't need as many workers. And so we actually see that there hasn't been an increase, and in fact a decline in employment over the period. And
What?
but I, if
Go
I
ahead.
sorry,
Sure. Yeah.
compensation is a good story. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So compensation in the space economy. When you look at average compensation, it's very high relative to the overall U.S. economy.
Okay.
So over $150,000 average compensation for a space economy job, and within manufacturing, it's over $200,000, which is a lot compared to other jobs. So the employees that are part of the space economy tend to be really well paid.
What role then do price indices play in understanding the space economy, and have you observed any notable trends?
Mhm. So price indices is how we measure real GDP, and real GDP just means so when economists are talking about is the economy growing or shrinking, we're talking about real GDP, and that means that we remove the impact of inflation. So what we're measuring is just whether production of goods and services, actual real things, has that increased or not. And so price indexes, we need price indexes to understand how prices have grown over the period, so that we can remove that effect to get a better understanding of real growth in the space economy and the overall economy. So price indexes, they sound a little boring, but they're so important for us to understand what's going on in the economy. Because if you didn't have price indexes and you would just see that things were growing, you wouldn't really know, okay, are we actually producing more things, or are prices just increasing? So that's something that has taken a lot of time to get accurate price indexes, because we also try to control for quality changes as well. And this is
Mhm.
really important for satellite manufacturing and GPS PNT equipment, because if you compare a satellite from 10 years ago to a satellite now does a lot more. There's a lot more capacity. And so what we see is not only are prices declining, but capacity is increasing. And so this has an impact on how we measure real GDP.
It's just like your cell phone.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
The iPhone you may have today does a lot more than the Razor that you had 10 years ago.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
My guest is Dr. Tina Highfill, research economist with the Bureau of Economic Analysis on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Tina, you mentioned the methodology that you use a little bit, but I want to find out if there are any specific challenges that you faced when creating that methodology and then applying it to gathering your statistics.
Mm. Yeah, there's a few challenges. So one I talked about earlier, determining the scope of the space economy. So when we measure the overall economy, what we're looking at is production of goods and services. And so within our statistics, we have a list of about 6,000 categories of goods and services. And so for the space economy, the first step was to look at that list and say, okay, what of these 6,000 categories, what is a space product? And so things like space vehicles and satellites were obvious, but there were other things like educational services that weren't necessarily as obvious. So if you're getting a degree in astronautical engineering or something, we wanted to include that. We want to have a broad, comprehensive measure of the space economy. So getting it took about a year to kind of figure out what should be included, where to put the guardrails on things, and to not go too far afield as well. So if you look at some of the private sector reports, especially the forecasts, they'll include things like Uber. They'll say Uber is a space company. And so that was something that it took a little time to kind of figure out those details of what should be included. And then the other thing we talked about is that we do have a little bit of a lag in terms of getting data in. So
Mhm.
we're working on that, but right now we're at about an 18-month lag. So in June of this year, we released data through 2022. So that constitutes an 18-month lag. And so I think, people always want to know what's happening now, and they want forecasts too. So
Sure.
I think the challenge is, trying to think if we can get statistics out sooner, which I think would benefit everybody.
How do the contributions of the government and the private sector industries in the space economy compare?
Mhm. So when we're talking about the government industry, we're talking about production by government employees, which is different than government spending. So, in the manufacturing sector, you'll have companies like Boeing and SpaceX, and a lot of their money comes from government, but that's still because it's a private sector producing the goods and services, that's considered the private sector. So the government sector in our statistics is a lot of it is Space Force, uh, DoD related space agencies, and NASA. There are other things like state and local government. They often run the spaceports that are around the country, but it's mostly federal government. And so what we see is that the contribution by government employees has actually increased over the period. So in 2017, the government industry represented about 20% of the GDP for the space economy, and it's now about 25%, which is pretty strong growth over such a short period of time. And so what we see is that a lot of this, as I mentioned, is coming from Space Force and also to a lesser extent NASA.
That's kind of interesting because when you talk about the whole privatization of the space industry, and that's what everybody talks about, the fact that there would be that much growth in the government sector seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. But I guess the government's buying a lot of stuff from private industry too.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just government employees, but also government spending in private sector has increased. If you think about some of the more well-known space companies, SpaceX, United Launch, a lot of their money comes from the government.
Mm.
And so I think there is a disconnect in terms of thinking about, well, this is a private company, but if the government wasn't their biggest customer, they probably, they may not be a big company, most likely wouldn't be. So I think you're right. There's definitely a disconnect there.
Even Elon would run out of money eventually. So how then does the U.S. space economy compare to those of other countries? And can we learn, what can we learn when we make those comparisons?
Well, so this is something really exciting that's going on. So the United States was the first statistical agency in the world to come up with official space economy statistics. Official meaning that the country's statistical office produced them. But I'm working with the European Space Agency and Eurostat, which is the statistical agency for the Europeans, to come up with statistics that are comparable to the U.S. statistics. Because right now it's really hard to compare the U.S. space economy statistics with other countries because they're not done in the same way. So you're not
Right.
really comparing the same thing. So we hope to, by I think next year, certain European countries are planning to produce statistics of their own, which will be great. But I will note that the Canadian Space Agency has put out a report on the economic impact of the Canadian space sector to Canada's economy for the past for many years. And what they show, so Canada's economy is much smaller than the United States economy. So what they show is that Canadian space sector contributed about $2 billion to Canadian GDP versus 132 billion in the United States. But in terms of percent of their economy, the Canadian space sector is also less than 1%. So I think, we'll see what the Europeans come up with in other countries. But I think the takeaway is that space is a relatively small part of most countries' economy, at least at this stage.
Tina, how can the public and the private sectors better engage with BEA's space economy statistics and help that to make that help drive innovation and growth?
Mhm. Well, I think so. We've been putting out statistics since 2020, and it's taken a while for the data to kind of proliferate and get down to kind of a normal space data user. And so I think the biggest thing that would engage private sector folks is to start looking at the data, using it, understanding it. We talked about the disconnect between the government contribution and private contribution. This is all in the data. And so I think, I'm just begging people to read our reports, to use the data. And one thing I think could really help with innovation and growth is to, have a better understanding of the industries that are contributing to the space economy and using our data as a basis for forecasts. We see a lot of forecasts out there from private sector, and people typically think about what is the value in 2040? What are they estimating is going to happen in 20
Sure.
years? And the thing is, with the forecast, it's so important what your starting point is. If you're starting with an unrealistically high number, then your forecast, no matter what, is going to be wrong. So my hope is that these forecasters will start using our data as their basis for their forecast in the future, to make it, a little bit more reasonable in terms of what they're predicting.
A couple of more questions for you. First of all, what are the current and future plans that you have for improving and expanding the space economy statistics?
Mhm. Well, what I alluded to earlier about the lag, we have an 18-month lag in publication
Hmm.
of our statistics. That is our number one goal and focus now, is to try to get those out faster. So we ultimately would like to have maybe a 12-month lag. So in a year later, we'd have statistics on the previous year, which is actually pretty quick for government statistics. So that is our main focus, trying to find data that will allow us to do those estimates. We're actually looking into using AI to help us better kind of synthesize private data, private reports, financial reports, and things like that. So we're really hoping to get the data out quicker. And we're also exploring state level statistics as well. Getting a figure on the United States space economy is hard enough, but going down to individual states is a challenge. But we've done it with other statistics in the past, and we know that there's a lot of user interest in doing that. So that's another thing that's on our forecast.
Well, I guess the good news is that at least you can be targeted in a couple of places. I mean, Florida being one, obviously, where there's a lot of space commerce. Texas would be a big one. So you don't have to go to every individual state. You have some targets of opportunity.
Yeah. Well, we typically do all the states if we're gonna do any state, but
Okay.
that's definitely fair in terms of looking for data. There are definitely hotspots around the country that would be more important to look to.
This is the point in the program where we normally ask our guests to make kind of look into their crystal balls. And I know you're not in the forecasting business, so I'm not going to do that to you. But what I would like to close with is if there are any specific trends that are standing out that you think that people should watch in particular as the space economy continues to grow, what should people be looking at?
Mhm. Well, I think looking at the contribution of the government of defense to the space economy is a big one. The Space Force is only getting bigger. If you look at our statistics in terms of GDP, the national defense contribution has doubled over the 6 year period, which is really fast growth. And so I think that we mentioned the disconnect between people not thinking about the contribution of national defense to the space economy, but that is a big one. And looking at budget documents and budget requests, it seems like it's only going to continue to grow. And I think the other thing is one of the tables we released this year for the first time are the price index tables. We mentioned earlier, this is really important for understanding the impact of inflation on the space economy. And so keeping an eye on those price index tables, I think, will be really important as inflation continues to proliferate throughout the economy, the overall economy and the space economy.
And I think that if there is a change in administration in November, it'll be very interesting, at least to me, to see what happens with NASA if they continue on the current focus that they have, which is far more, it seems to me to be far more environment and earth science than it does to be in space. Artemis notwithstanding, and see, if they change that focus and what impact that might have on the space economy. Just tossing that out there, not asking you to comment, but you're welcome to if you like.
Well, I'm also curious to see what happens too. I work pretty closely with the National Space Council, which is headed by the vice president.
Mm-hmm.
So it does, whoever's in office does impact, kind of what's important and what happens in space. So I'll also be very curious to see.
Tina, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Dr. Tina Highfill is a research economist with the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Department of Commerce. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. You can get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at xterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers, like Galileo, the proof is looking glass. Thirst for reason, our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, known by view. Like finding water on the moon.